President Trump pivots again on his policy towards Russia and Ukraine, imposing new sanctions this week on the Russian oil giants Lukoil and Rosneft. Oil prices rise in response around the world, and Europe follows with its own sanctions. Trump also calls off his summit in Hungary, expected in a week or so, with Vladimir Putin. Is Donald Trump changing his policy towards Russia, or merely trying to maybe buy more time to head off tougher sanctions in Congress?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
That's our subject for today on Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. This is our daily podcast, and I'm here with my colleagues Joe Sternberg and Alicia Finley. So on and off again, Trump on Russia. What week is it? We don't seem to know the policy. 2 weeks ago, he was getting tough on Putin and considering sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. Then he has a phone call with Putin out of the blue last week and changes his mind again on the Tomahawks, and then lectures Vladimir Zelensky, Ukrainian president, who visited the Oval Office on Friday. And the president says he's going to meet with Putin. Well, then this week, that's off. And the president imposes these new sanctions and calls off his meeting. Let's listen to Donald Trump talk about why.
Well, I think that in terms of honesty, the only thing I can say is every time I speak with Vladimir, I have good conversations, and then they don't go anywhere. They just don't go anywhere. So in that sense, but no, look, he's fighting a war. He's in a war. That's two very competent sides, and that's the way war is. You never know with war, but I would say that it's time to make a deal. A lot of people are dying.
And then let's listen to him talk about why he canceled the meeting.
I don't want to have a wasted meeting. I don't want to have a waste of time, so I'll see what happens. But we did all of these great deals, great peace deals. They're all peace deals. They're agreements, solid agreements, every one of them. But this one, and I said, go to the line of battle, the battlefield lines, and you pull back and you go home, and everybody takes some time off, because you got two countries that are killing each other. Two countries are losing 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers a week. So we'll see what happens.
Well, Joe, can you make sense of this back and forth? What is going on here in the president's head?
Oh, gosh, if I knew the answer to that. Look, I think that what is basically happening is, as we have known all along, President Trump's instinct is to try to solve every problem by dealing his way out of it. And he keeps colliding with the fact that the deal-making doesn't align fundamentally with Vladimir Putin's objectives in this Ukraine war going back to 2022 and well before that. And so it seems like we're trapped in this Groundhog Day style constant learning and relearning process where Trump somehow convinces himself that Putin is amenable to deal making, and then all of a sudden reality reasserts itself, and the Russians launch another bombing attack on Ukrainian civilians, and Trump realizes that that is not the kind of interlocutor he would be confronting if he had gone to Budapest for this. So I think that it's this weird thing that I just, after all this time, still don't completely understand, where on the one hand, Trump is capable of amazing realism about what's actually happening on the ground, and at other times is prone to these flights of fancy about the prospect that you could actually negotiate a deal with the Kremlin that would end this.
Yeah, Trump, I think, Alicia, really badly wants a deal. He wants to be, to add to his reputation that he wants to promote as the peacemaker. And yet he keeps running up against Vladimir Putin. And after the meeting, after his phone call with Putin, the two leaders agreed last week, according to my reporting, to have a phone call with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, to prepare for this Budapest meeting. Now, apparently, reportedly, and even you've seen public expressions of this, Lavrov said nothing has changed. we're not going to settle for your idea, Mr. President, that you're going to retreat from current lines, because that's not what we want. We want all of the Donbass. We want to be in a position where our historical grievances are recognized, which means limits on what Ukraine can do in its own self-defense, not joining NATO ever, and limitations on any security guarantees provided by the West. None of that's going to be acceptable to Ukraine. And now Ukraine is backed by the Europeans. They'll find it not acceptable. So Trump finds himself with no deal. And suddenly now he's turning to more back towards pressure on Putin.
Right. So at least Lavrov was being honest, because I don't think they've been interested in a deal for a long time. But now it appears that President Trump, at least at the moment, is going to try to escalate at least the economic pressure on Russia. And that's what these oil sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which are the two biggest oil producers in Russia, are intended to do. The aim is to reduce the oil and to some extent gas revenues, because Europe also imposed some sanctions hitting the Russian LNG gas, which are really funding Russia's war machine. About 1/3 of Russia's budget is from revenues or royalties from oil and gas productions and exports. The latest sanctions that the U.S. is imposing are directly on Rosneft and Lukoil, and so any entities in countries like China and or India, who are the main buyers of Russian oil, they would not be able to transact in U.S. dollars, and they'd be cut off from the U.S. capital system if they continue to buy from Lukoil and Rosneft. Now, the question is, how big of an effect will this actually have?
I want to ask about that, because clearly the markets seem to think it'll have some effect, because the oil price globally, the Brent crude, popped to $66 or so, a little under, up from what was closer to 60 about a week ago. And it popped a couple of dollars a barrel in the wake of the president's announcement. So the markets are kind of figuring that there's going to be some effect on global supply. Then we've seen indications that maybe Reliance, the big Indian company purchasing oil, isn't going to buy anymore, and maybe some Chinese institutions as well.
So the Chinese for the Chinese state-owned refineries have put on pause for the time being, a short-term pause, their purchases of Russian oil or from those two producers. Biden had already sanctioned the other smaller producers. So for all intents and purposes, most of the Russian crude is now sanctioned. But the question is whether the Chinese, their teapot refineries, which are kind of the smaller independent producers who have basically helped Iran circumvent the sanctions on its oil.
And operate outside of the dollar system.
Exactly. Yeah. We'll be able to continue to buy and we'll kind of soak up that supply, while India's you mentioned Reliance has said that it's going to stop its purchases, and some other larger Indian refiners may do so as well. And so they may get more or buy more crude from the Middle East, and that may tighten the supply. Again, the big question is to what extent will the Trump administration enforce these sanctions, and how well will Russia be able to circumvent them with intermediaries? At least that's what my sources say.
Joe, I think if you're a layman on this subject, and you looked at the event of this week and you said, well, wait a minute, the war started in February 2022. And you mean to tell me that the two biggest Russian oil companies have not had sanctions put on them? What in the world was Joe Biden doing? And what about why wasn't Trump doing something on this before now? And I think the answer in part is that the President of the United States, President Biden, was worried about the rise in oil prices and how it could affect his political fortunes. And of course, the Europeans still import enormous amounts of Russian oil and gas. Now they're starting to actually wean themselves off of that. But it's something of a scandal that we're fighting this war, and Ukraine is fighting this war. And in many ways, it's an existential issue for parts of Europe, I think, because if Russia wins, the threats to their security are enormous. And yet, they just haven't taken it seriously enough to impose the worst possible economic sanctions you could get.
Exactly. And I think, Paul, that there is a political economy explanation for that, and then also a strategic explanation for the situation that might even feed back into what's been going on with Trump's thinking about all of this. So, I mean, on the political economy side, you flag the important issue, which is the political implication of high oil prices, which is something that no U.S. president wants to deal with. And then also the economic reality that it has taken this long for Europe to put itself in a position where they could think about imposing this kind of oil sanction without doing catastrophic damage to their own economy. And I think that is a really embarrassing state of affairs for Europe, which predates the Ukraine invasion in 22, and frankly is going to continue for a while because they are still very far from having a handle on what they need to do to guarantee their own energy security moving forward. So I think that it's kind of an embarrassing statement about political willpower in the Biden administration, and then also economic resilience in Europe that they weren't able to do it before now. But I think there's also a strategic element here. I mean, when we think about Trump's approach in particular, we often focus on the bad advice that he gets from the right, from people in the MAGA circle who are very sympathetic to Putin's war aims in Ukraine and have a very warped view of the history of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and are sympathetic to Putin's attempt to reconstitute a Russian empire. But the alternative to that, often in what you could think of as the mainstream, has also been a lot of really bad strategic thinking that kept warning the Biden administration and European capitals that something like sanctioning these oil companies would be an escalation that Putin would meet with escalation. And I think that because of this paranoia about doing something that Putin might perceive as too escalatory, that has often led Western governments to hold back when they could have been imposing these sanctions much sooner and impose this kind of pressure on Putin. And what we have learned every other time someone has taken this step that we were told the Kremlin would find intolerable, it's turned out that that pressure has borne some kind of result. And we may very well discover that the same thing is here, but it was that fear of causing escalation or somehow this worry about annoying the person who started the war that led to holding off on these kinds of sanctions before now.
As you look at the oil markets, which I know you follow, Alicia, you can make a case that, and I would, in fact, that the pop up in prices hasn't been all that great. That $66 a barrel for Brent crude is still surprisingly low. If this had happened in the past, before the U.S. fracking boom, for example, I think you would have seen $100 oil, $120 oil in this kind of environment. But the world has, the people who follow oil supplies have been predicting a significant supply glut here for not only now, but going into the next year. The Saudis have been gearing up their production for reasons that they need more revenue. And of course, the U.S. Fracking boom, production in the Permian continues. And surprisingly, even when the oil price hits 60, it's still continuing. So a lot of production going on. And that might account for the fact that prices haven't spiked even more with this action. Now, if the administration would move further and impose sanctions, as some in Congress want, directly on China and more on India, because there is a tariff already on Indian goods, but particularly on China, you might see, for purchasing Russian oil, you might see prices go up. But I mean, that the supply glut gives Trump some cushion in terms of the domestic political impact of the sanctions.
I think that's right. What you've had during the Biden administration was the problem is that they were really worried about the political optics because they knew that they would be blamed for higher oil prices, in part because they were doing so much on the domestic front to restrict production with their policies. And they were really gave Republicans a lot of ammunition. What happened after the Ukraine or the invasion in February 2022, you did see prices spike. Recall they went
Right.
up to over $110 because some people worried that this would result in a total suspension of Russian crude and exports. And gradually they came down as more oil flowed onto the global markets. The U.S. did ban imports, and Russia did impose some kind of restrictions on seaborne imports of Russian crude, though some continue to go to Hungary and Slovakia through pipelines. But you're right about the broader story is about the leverage that the U.S. now has because of shale fracking and our fossil fuel abundance, so to speak. If you listen or you talk to some of these oil companies, they say that they can continue to make money even were prices to go down to $50 a barrel. A lot of that has to do with technology and technological improvements, especially
Sure.
in the Permian.
Right.
And so what will happen is if oil prices increase, that'll provide a further incentive just to produce even more in the U.S.
Permian Basin, of course, is in the American Southwest, principally in Texas. Joe, the larger question here, I think, concerns Donald Trump and his policy in Russia and where he's going to come out. I think that my own view, my reporting suggests that there's a real debate in this administration and larger debate among Republicans in Congress about how to proceed. You have the hawkish group led in the Senate by Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, and Ted Cruz, who are close to the administration and want it to start to get tougher with Ukraine and with Russia, both on the weapons front, but also on the sanctions front. And there are bills in the Senate moving ahead in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that would sanction the Russians, secondary sanctions, so-called, on purchases of Russian oil, also sanctions on Russia for declaring its human rights violations for the kidnapping of children in Ukraine, and there's other measures as well. And the president of the United States has said, he's pushed back on that. He doesn't want those to go to the floor. But the longer that Putin continues not to move at all on negotiations and to basically say, I want to make Ukraine a kind of rump Russian state, which is his real geostrategic goal, I think Trump, the only way he's going to get Putin to the table is to put more help for Ukraine and weapons flow, and then also much tougher economic and other sanctions that will squeeze the Russian economy.
And I think it's important to understand that the tension that the administration is under is between that hawkish wing in the Congress, and I think there's a good chance that a lot of that sanctions legislation would probably pass if given the opportunity.
Oh, I think it would. If it went to the floor, it would easily have 60 votes in the Senate.
Well, compare that to the fact that a lot of the skepticism of that sort of hawkishness seems to be concentrated among what you might think of as MAGA theorists, people who've been writing a lot in various online publications or that sort of thing. And it's also very concentrated in the, what used to be called the blogosphere or the podcast world on that part of the MAGA right. And I think
if I may interrupt here, Joe, not only that, there's elements of it, faction in the Pentagon on the Undersecretary of the Defense for Strategy, Elbridge Colby, who would just as soon us move out of Ukraine, and to the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance is in that faction. He is advances very, very attuned to what Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and the mega isolationists are saying, and he doesn't want to get on their bad side as he approaches 2028.
Well, and that feeds into the important point here, which is that J.D. Vance and President Trump would do well to remember who in this picture has actually been elected by someone. And those members of Congress who would vote for the sanctions legislation have won elections. They have actual constituents in America that they are talking to, and they're prepared to support it.
The vice president would say he's been elected too.
Well, I think that he has, and I mean, part of the Trump's gift in this situation is that he was elected on such a flexible Russia policy that what Trump won on the basis of could accommodate pretty much any outcome here. But I think that an important signal to the administration is coming from about where the public is on a lot of this is coming from the fact that hawkish wing is so prevalent in the Congress, and you could get so much support on Capitol Hill from this. I think that they have to be very careful not to be distracted by some of this noise in that ecosystem and lose sight of the fact that American voters are probably much more tolerant of or even enthusiastic for a relatively hawkish approach to Russia to end the war that way instead of rolling over and trying to negotiate with Putin on any terms.
Nobody wants a war with Russia, for sure. And my argument, Alicia, would be that the likeliest path to a war is if you accommodate Putin's ambitions in Ukraine, and then he consolidates that and then decides where next he would strike in Europe with guerrilla tactics or a variety of other things he started with in Ukraine. So that, I think, is the deterrence argument. But when it comes to the pressure on Putin economically, everything is now going to be on enforcement. That's going to rely on enforcement. Will the U.S. Treasury and the allies enforce the sanctions, or are they going to be just political eyewash?
Well, I think that's right. And that was the issue with the Biden administration and Iran, is that they just didn't enforce those sanctions. And so, not surprisingly, Iran was able to continue to export its oil, wrapped up under Joe Biden after kind of a maximum pressure campaign that was leveraged under Donald Trump. And that is a real risk with Donald Trump, who's very mercurial. Right now, he's angry at Putin. A couple more days, wait, they'll make up. This kind of feels like a Taylor Swift song. We are never getting back together.
Trump wants to get back together.
That's, I think, the issue. And so maybe Putin makes some gestures in the right direction. Trump will ease up on the enforcement of the sanctions.
All right. Well, we're going to see how that goes. As Donald Trump would say, we'll see what happens. So thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for listening to Potomac Watch. We are here every day. Hope you'll be with us tomorrow.